Kenshi is a sandbox survival simulator that offers a huge amount of freedom and depth, and while it might be rough around the edges, it's also one of the most fun and addictive games released last year. It's a game about starting with nothing in a harsh and unforgiving world, and then learning how to survive. There's an open-endedness about how you do this. You have different options even from the very beginning. You can find ore to mine and just labour away, try your luck as a thief, or just get out there and see what you can scavenge, but regardless of how you try to make your way in the world, you can't escape the unquestionable reality that you are weak. Very weak. And this is a world that doesn't care about you at all. In Kenshi, you are not the main character of an RPG. There are no easily achievable quests, no simple progression path to pull you along, and no rats in basements waiting to be killed. There is an in-game tutorial that teaches you the basics of the UI and controls, but even the tutorial goes out of its way to tell you that there's no set objectives for you to do, and that you'll need to find your way yourself. And once you do that, once you leave the safety of the city walls, you'll soon find out just how hostile this world really is. Alone and vulnerable, you'll be attacked by starving bandits who will rob you of your possessions. You'll get chased by aggressive wildlife that can rip you to shreds if they catch up with you, and if you're really unlucky, you'll come across some slavers who will put you in chains and sell you for a few coins. All this can make starting out in Kenshi very daunting. The world is cruel, and saying that the game doesn't hold your hand is an understatement. But while Kenshi's world is very harsh, its game design is actually very forgiving. Death is rare. You might get knocked out and robbed, but it's not like you'll have much worth taking early on anyway. Slavery might not be a pleasant experience, but it's a great way to train your body, and there'll be an opportunity to escape sooner or later. Cannibals might take you back to their base, tie you to a stick, and slowly eat you alive limb by limb. But you might still get rescued, and later down the line, losing a limb has its advantages. Still, it's how stat progression works that you really need to understand. There are many skills, but they're all leveled in the same way, by doing related activities, a bit like in the Elder Scrolls or in certain old school RPGs. So whatever you do, you'll be making some kind of progress, even if only slowly. You can run around the world, getting lost and achieving absolutely nothing, but in doing so you'll at least be leveling up your athletics. You can mine iron ore and carry it back to a city to sell, and only make enough money to cover your food costs, but you'll also be leveling your labour and strength skills. You can lose every fight you encounter and be beaten to near death over and over, but in doing so you'll be raising your toughness. And so in Kenshi, what doesn't kill you really does make you stronger, and strength is everything. And really, that's what Kenshi is all about. Starting weak and becoming strong. Combat itself is simple, and resembles a real-time strategy game more than anything else. You right-click to attack and then sit back and watch the carnage. There are a few small things you can do to micromanage your squad to try to get an edge, like utilising options to block or taunt, positioning ranged characters or kiting, but combat is usually just decided by stats as opposed to skill, and if you're looking for deep tactical combat, you won't find it here. Fights at least look pretty good though thanks to well-made animations, and it's always good to see limb damage systems as a feature. But Kenshi isn't really about the combat, it's about the feeling of progression. You're always getting more money, better gear, and seeing your stats slowly rise higher and higher, while at the same time you'll learn more and more about how to survive in this world. Initially you'll be too weak to fight anything yourself, but that doesn't mean you can't scavenge. You can wait for others to fight each other, and loot the corpses while they're still busy beating each other to death. And if you do attract unwanted attention, you can run to the nearest settlement and let the guards do the work for you. Once you have a bit of money, you'll have the option to start recruiting others to help you, and suddenly the amount you can mine or loot will go up. You'll start equipping the gear you scavenge, and with your newfound numbers you might even start to win fights against the weakest of opponents. And so your money and stats will keep rising, little by little. Probably the most common thing to do next would be to buy a cheap house in a settlement where you can research basic things within the safety of the city walls, while at the same time travelling around to all nearby cities, scavenging as you go, and using your money to hire more recruits. Once you've raised your squad numbers, combat stats and technology a bit, you can head on out into the world and find a place to call your own, where you can start building an actual base. But while this is what most players will do, you don't have to follow this route. You can play solo and still be an effective killing machine thanks to how the game handles combat. You can keep your squad small and specialised and just travel the world exploring. You can buy bigger houses in cities to keep researching more things, and then start leveling weapon or armor crafting still within the safe confines of the city, and just get by through buying all needed materials. Or you can hire a bigger squad, but stick to the nomadic life. Maybe buy some pack animals and go from city to city trading, fighting and exploring as you wish. So there's lots of ways to play, each with their own advantages and each of which can be rewarding in their own way. But most people will be drawn to base building sooner or later, and that's where Kenshi really sinks its hooks into you. By building a base, you can start up your own industry by assigning jobs to characters so that they can farm, mine and craft without any supervision from the player. This can lead to easy money, food, and eventually high quality armor and weapons. However, building a base will also draw attention to yourself. Where you choose to settle will determine what challenges you face. Fertile areas will provide better food, but will also have wildlife that wants to eat your crops. Settling near civilization will offer some protection and trade options, but those same civilizations will expect something in return, like taxes, food tributes, or adherence to their strict and oppressive religious code. Remote locations might bring less attention, but might also make you isolated when you're most in need of help. But everywhere will have some dangers, and there'll always be at least some bandits who will look to you as weak and an easy target to raid. And so the base building side of the game is a bit like RimWorld. Build a base, set automated jobs, tweak small problems to keep production going, and defend against raids. But unlike RimWorld, the game doesn't deliberately scale all raids down to the player's level to make them manageable. In fact, Kenshi is a game where nothing is scaled, and so getting a working, defensible base up and running is not an easy task. Raiding bandits can easily kick your ass, wildlife can be a constant cause of problems, and taxation and food tributes can rob you of what little profit you might be able to make. But there are ways to survive, and every time you get beaten down or bullied by bigger factions, it gives you one more piece of motivation to keep training and keep improving. And that's why Kenshi works so well. It's not just that the world is harsh and makes the player feel weak and insignificant, it's by doing this the game gives you constant motivation to want to get stronger. At its core, Kenshi is a huge grind. Raising your stats takes large amounts of time. Even getting a base up and running, which is in some ways where the game really begins, won't happen until hours into most players' playthroughs, and if you don't want a game that takes a long time to get anywhere, then Kenshi is likely not for you. But for others, the grind feels rewarding because you're aware of how much you've had to work for your progress, and in the end, it feels worth it. If you stick at it, there will come a day when a bandit faction that gave you trouble early on will turn up at your gate, making threats and demanding money. And you won't be the same weak band of survivors that can be pushed around anymore.
Who are you talking to right now? Who is it you think you see?
And when you laugh in their face and then proceed to crush them, it will feel good. And you don't have to stop there. Every faction has their own base with their own leader, so not only can you defend yourself, you can also head out to their base to make sure they really understand how things are now. There's no way to demand tribute yourself, but bandit leaders will usually have a bounty, and their base will have good loot, and so just as once you were the weak being raided by the strong, now your positions will have reversed. But there are always stronger opponents out there. Kenshi isn't a game with an ending, but it's definitely still a long game, and there's a surprising amount of endgame content. If you want to keep playing, there always seems to be more things to do, more places to go, and more deadly opponents to defeat. It's partly because the game world is so big, which it really is. It completely dwarfs most modern open world games in terms of scale. But Kenshi's world has more going for it than just size. Kenshi's setting is really good. It's like a mix between Dune, Morrowind and Fallout, with extra samurai swords thrown into the mix. It's interesting and unique, but what's most impressive is how well realised it feels. Kenshi doesn't have a story in the traditional sense, but the world building is fantastic. From the realistic topography of its diverse landscapes to the imposing sense of scale of the game world, to the lore behind each faction and the mystery behind how the world got to be as fucked up as it is. There's a believability to the details of this world, as if everything has been thought out and designed with realism in mind. There are farms to support the in-game populations, military bases along the edges of factions' lands, and ruins marking previous faction borders. When you're told about two factions being at war with one another, you can go to where their lands border and watch them fight. When you overhear about legendary criminals or formidable generals, you know that these are real people. They exist in this world, and you can go and find them and fight them to see if they live up to their reputation. And when you're told about a location so dangerous that no one who goes there returns, you know there's going to be a real reason why that is, and you'll have a strong desire to find it out for yourself. You might not even notice it at first, but it's hard not to be drawn into this world as you spend time trying to survive here. You become curious, you want to know more, but just as the world doesn't care about you as an individual, it also doesn't care about giving you answers to your questions. The storytelling feels similar to Dark Souls, but with less item descriptions. Details are placed about like breadcrumbs, but there's never any guarantee you'll find what you're looking for at the end of the trail. You can speak to some NPCs, but this isn't a game with much dialogue, and no one really wants to talk to you. You can find a few in-game books, but what they offer is more propaganda than actual history. Companions might provide comments on places you go to, but it's nearly always in the form of warnings rather than explanations. And yet somehow this just makes you more interested, and despite the lack of an actual storyline, discovering the lore is a fun part of the game and one of the big motivations to keep playing and exploring at endgame. And you can also change the world. Despite there being no real quests, in-game NPCs do occasionally have requests, and your actions can have real impacts. You can help a few factions take over other factions, leading to cities changing ownership and even cosmetic changes like statues being torn down. These consequences can be quite shallow, and there's no way to formally wage war or conquer cities yourself. But it's still great that at least some things you do have world-changing impacts, and seeing that one big faction you really hate get conquered thanks to you makes for a nice endgame goal to set yourself. So the journey Kenshi provides really is great, but the game also has a lot of problems, and there's a distinct lack of polish for a game that has just been officially released. Some of the biggest issues are poor camera control that creates a lot of trouble when coupled with tight spaces and varied topographies, performance and optimization issues that lead to a lower overall frame rate than you'd expect for a game that looks like this, as well as regular loading as you travel around, and also pathing issues that sometimes cause one party member to be left behind, stuck in a building or on a rock, and which also affects enemy raids and travelers, sometimes leading to odd results. There's other problems that are less impactful but can still be annoying. The Alt key highlights items and building signs, but there's no way to highlight corpses, or NPCs you can talk to, or lootable containers, and sometimes these things can be very hard to see, particularly in the case of corpses in certain biomes, which can be a pain to loot. On the subject of loot, inventory management can also feel clunky and overly time-consuming when you consider how much of it there is. The UI itself can be quite practical in that it has a lot of information on the screen, and so you can often see what you need to with few clicks, but this also has the disadvantage of making the UI feel quite cluttered. There are also some features you'd expect to be in the game which aren't, like having the ability to kill downed enemies to stop them waking up later on, or having an official Iron Man mode that removes the ability to manually save and load. And then there are balance issues or small annoyances that exist, like not having the option to recruit more than 30 characters, not being able to remove limbs through simple methods, or the 2 weak gates that can be destroyed easily by any large group of weak foes, and so on. However, Kenshi does have an active modding scene, and certain mods can go a long way at fixing smaller issues players might have with the game and allowing you to customize your experience to your liking. And finally, there's the obvious issue that Kenshi looks a little dated. Of course, it still has a great aesthetic, and there can be a real beauty to its empty and alien-looking landscapes, but it still looks a bit like a game that was made quite a few years ago. Which makes a lot of sense because this game has been in development for 12 years, and its graphics haven't seen much improvement in that time. But what Kenshi may lack in graphics and polish, it makes up for by offering an experience that feels unlike anything else out there, with one of the best worlds I've ever seen in a game, and an incredibly addicting and enjoyable progression loop. Kenshi is a great game that deserves more attention, and if you can look past the dated visuals, put up with its performance issues, and aren't put off by a game that takes a large amount of time to make any progress in, then Kenshi offers one of the best sandbox open world gaming experiences out there, and I'd strongly recommend it to anyone interested.